This is a fan-generated show. If you would like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com, and also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Good evening. Welcome to the Jamie Glazov Moment. Tonight, the leftist-fascist terror at Evergreen State College. Ladies and gentlemen, those of you that are following what's happening in academia know that leftist fascism has completely taken over, of course, for quite some time, but they're solidifying their power, and there's no longer any free speech. We know that, David Horowitz, Ann Coulter recently couldn't even go to Berkeley. We know the Berkeley riots that occurred to try to stop Milo from speaking at Berkeley. I mean, this is just happening at campuses across the country. And so something just recently that I want to talk a little bit about tonight was what happened at Evergreen recently. And, and there's some video footage of just these leftist fascists and red guards and brown shirts running around, and they're screaming about racism and white supremacy and capitalist oppression, et cetera, when in fact they are actually the real racists and oppressors. And but there's actually very interesting video footage of something that happened at Evergreen recently. And they're tormenting their president, or I think it might be an administrator. And while they're tormenting him and sadistically and very cruelly screaming at him and ridiculing him, at one point they instruct him and order him to keep his hands at his side. He's not allowed to raise his hands, and he follows these Khmer Rouge style orders. Take a look.
What's your action?
Put your hand down. Watch yourself. That's not appropriate. You gotta put your hands down. You gotta put your hands down.
Yes, Ike! Ike is a damn fool, y'all.
Okay? The thing is that my ancestors were slaves and your ancestors were not. Your ancestors came here of free choice and decided to bring along my people not of their own free will to work and build this country. Okay? And so I'm just letting you know that slavery still has repercussions in society today. And that is what we're here about. Those repercussions. It doesn't go away. It's not over.
So that is very frightening footage, but very, very important for us to recognize exactly what's happening there. Because, ladies and gentlemen, yes, we've got these leftist fascists terrorizing everyone and imposing their fascistic views on everyone. And as you know, even some of the latest things that are happening is they're telling that white people have to leave the university for a certain day or a certain time period, etc. But in this footage, watch it again if you have to, but you can see that while they're tormenting their school president, I think that was George Bridges in that video that they're tormenting, and you can see that when they tell him how to keep his hands at his side, watch it again. You can hear the laughter, the sadistic ridicule, and the pleasure and ecstasy that the people in the background of laughing and yelling at him, you can see the pleasure that they're deriving from this sadism and humiliating him and telling him how he's not allowed to lift his arms and he has to keep his hands down. But those of you that know the history of communist revolutions and of communist oppression and how the killing fields begin, go back to the Maoist Cultural Revolution in China, and look into how they treated and what happened to the teachers at the universities and the schools and all those recrimination sessions that they had, and the ridicule and the torment and the sadism that was involved in what they did to the teachers publicly in front of the communities, in front of people. It's just horrifying, really frightening stuff. And this clip where they tell him to keep his hands at his side. This is the beginning. I mean, not necessarily even the beginning, it's happening. But what I'm saying is that the seeds, this is how the seeds are planted for the Maoist Cultural Revolution, for the Khmer Rouge killing fields, because it begins to grow. It's just telling him to keep his hands at his side right now, but it begins to grow and it begins to branch out into many, many other areas. And then we have Maoism, we have Stalinism, and we have, of course, what we see as leftist fascism here. Very frightening video and very indicative, the sadistic pleasure and urges that you see there, and how just the pleasure that those students are deriving from what they're doing to him. I will say this just very briefly, just a few very quick thoughts here on that clip and what it represents. You know, they're all screaming, they're all yelling, but I was wondering, what kind of victims are these people? How much are they really suffering? You know, as I watch these videos of these leftist fascists screaming about what victims they are, as a person that has spent his life studying the Holocaust, studying the Gulag, studying what happens to dissidents in Cuba, in communist China, what happened in the communist revolutions, they didn't seem that oppressed to me, the students in these videos, in terms of perhaps enduring starvation or malnutrition or torture marks on their body, or worrying about, you know, what happens to their family members or to themselves. I will say this, you know, Paul Hollander in his works Political Pilgrims and Anti-Americanism, where he dissects the leftist mindset, he always pointed out that these leftist fascists, they're screaming and yelling, but always on the assumption that nothing will happen to them. So it's very interesting, this victimization that they believe is happening to them, and yet the real victim, including in that video, is the person that they're tormenting. And as they're engaged in all of this, how much have they really suffered? What kind of victims are they? They know exactly that nothing will happen to them. But I would recommend to them, and I know it would be useless with most of these kind of people, but even to share these thoughts of real suffering. Read Humberto Fontova's book on Castro and look up his works, and he's documented the horrendous, atrocious suffering of dissidents in Cuba and in Cuban prisons. I mean, I think that that's real victimization and real suffering. I mean, if you look into what happened to, you know, dissidents in the Gulag in the Soviet Union, in Maoist China, what happened to the Khmer Rouge, if you just even think about a brave woman today, maybe in Saudi Arabia or Iran, that would take off her hijab and refuse to wear it and walk into the street, in terms of what would happen to a dissident like that. If you would think about perhaps somebody that would open up a booth in the public square in Saudi Arabia and Iran and just start saying that they don't want to be a Muslim anymore, and start saying things that are, you know, regarded as, counter to Islam, what would happen to those people? I think that that's where the real victims are and the real suffering is. And so I just wanted to comment on this bizarre, surreal footage of these spoiled, entitled, leftist, fascist students screaming and yelling, and yet they're not victimized at all, and yet they're doing the victimizing. As a last thought, I also have been reflecting on the theme of how utopian revolutions devour their own children. And when you look at that clip, now I don't really necessarily know the background of that president in particular, but in a lot of these cases, the people that are now the professors, the administrators, many of them are actually leftists. And they are the ones that solidified and spawned and engineered, and they constructed all of this leftist reality on campus. And now all of a sudden, they are becoming the victims of the new generation of leftist fascists. And so it's very interesting how this is playing out on campuses now, where the leftists themselves are now being devoured by the new guard. you know, and so even little examples like the typical, let's say, white leftist revolutionary who's been preaching socialism and leftism his whole life, and then all of a sudden black students come up to him now from Black Lives Matter and say, by the way, you're white, you can't come to the university tomorrow. It's segregated tomorrow. It's black space only tomorrow. This is actually what's happening. And this is only the beginning. What's the next stage? What's the next stage? In Stalinist Russia and in many other communist environments, the executioners were later executed by the new executioners. The utopian revolutions devour their own. And a little warning and a heads up to the revolutionaries in academia today and in all realms: be careful what you wish for. We'll see you on the next Jamie Glazov Moment. Good night.